Hi, I'm Christoph, and today we're going to make a procedural rock shader in Blender that looks like it has been hand painted. I based these on rocks from the Ghibli movies Spirited Away and Tales from Earthsea, and they use gouache and watercolors to give it a very dynamic texture, and I hope I got pretty close using only nodes. I incorporated these rocks into this water scene, and I hope you can find some use for them also. So without further ado, let's dive into Blender and get started. Let's open a new scene. Let's delete the cube, delete the camera, and delete the light. And we are going to add a plane and also a mesh UV sphere. Let's click on the UV sphere and go to Object, Shade Smooth. And let's dive into the shader editor. Let's create a new material. We're going to replace the principled shader by an emission shader. And let's call this rock shader. Let's go to our plane and let's apply the same rock shader. The first thing we are going to add is a voronoi texture. And let's plug the color into the color of the emission. Let's also add a mapping node and a texture coordinate node. Let's add a color ramp after the voronoi. And this is going to provide us with our first layer of paint. But as you can see, this does not look like paint strokes because paint strokes has more softer edges, and it also randomizes a bit between more soft and hard edges. So to do this, we are going to set the F1 on the voronoi to smooth F1. And as you can see, we can switch between a soft and a hard edge. But we want to randomize this a bit. So let's add a noise texture. Let's add a color mix RGB. Plug the noise texture into the mix RGB. And we're going to plug the mix into the smoothness. Set the color to white. And we're also going to add a color ramp. Now, this is going to be like a controller that controls the amount. And we can also control a bit of the amount with the color ramp as well. We're going to set the scale to 100 and detail to 50. And now we're also going to play around with the color ramp, and I'm going to set it like this. As you can see, this gives us a bit of a texture to our edges and gives us more control. You can get different effects by playing around with the scale as well. If you want a more rough effect, this looks more like wet paint, or you can get a more grainy result. I'm going to set it to 100 for now. And I'm also going to play around with the randomness. We can get a more square effect, and I'm going to set it to 0.6. The next thing we are going to do is we're going to break up these hard lines. And to do that, we are going to modify the scale. To do this, we are also going to add a noise texture and a color mix RGB. We're going to set the color to a full white. Plug the color into the mix node and the mix node into the scale. Again, our mix node is going to be like a controller for the amount of distortion. I'm going to set our noise to 2D, our scale to 30, and the detail to 0.01. I want a very subtle effect, so I'm going to set it to 0.95 at the mix shader. And as you can see, this breaks up all of the hard lines. You can get more crazy effects, of course, by playing around with the settings. Also on the scale. But we're going to set it to 30 and 0.95 for now. The next thing we are going to add is a second layer of detail. Let's add another voronoi texture. We can just copy paste this one. Plugging the mapping into the vector. We're also going to plug this mix node into the smoothness. And we're going to set the scale to 27. To see the result, we're going to mix this in with the other node. So let's add a color mix RGB node and plug the color into the mix. Let's set it to soft light. And let's set the mix to 0.5. And set randomness to 0.8. This gives us another layer of texturing. Just a very small and subtle effect, as if we've added little paint dabs. The next thing we are going to do is randomize this texture. To do this, we are going to add a object info. And to randomize it once, we can plug in the random node. But let's take the location for now and plug it into the mapping location. And now when we move around our sphere, it just randomizes our texture, so we get a new one each time. So this will generate some unique rocks. Next up, we are going to add some shadow. And to do this, I'm going to use a gradient texture to get some manual control over the shading. We could also add a diffuse and then use the shader to RGB to use some lights for the shading, but for now I'm going to show you this gradient method, which I like because it gives you a manual control over the shadow. So let's add a gradient texture. We're going to set it to linear, which it already is. Let's add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And then we're going to plug it into a mix RGB node. Let's plug this into our emission shader so we can see what we're doing. And we are also going to plug our soft light into this mix node. Let's also add a color ramp after the mix node. And currently our shadow is on the wrong side. So let's rotate it by setting the Y to 90. And now by controlling the color ramp and the mix node, we can get some interesting shadows or highlights. Okay, let's plug our original color ramp back into the emission shader. And we are going to add a mix RGB node and plug our shadow into it. And let's set it to multiply. This gives us a custom shadow that we can control by using the color ramp. And also by using the mix, we can control how much texture we have at the edge of our shadow. Let's also add a color ramp for a highlight. So add a color ramp. Let's plug our mix into this color ramp. We're going to add another mix RGB after our multiply. And we are going to plug this color ramp into the mix. But instead of the color, we're going to plug it into the alpha. And let's set our color to red for now, just to see what we are doing. And by controlling the color ramp, we can get a custom highlight with a color that we choose. So let's set the color to white for now. And so now we have a shadow. And we also have a highlight that we can control. Now let's add some color. To do this, let's go to the color ramp that's connected to our soft light. Let's select the black and let's select a gray color for this one, but we're going to make it slightly blue. Let's add another color. This time we are going to make it a more dark green. And we can add a third color. Let's also make this a gray color. Let's make it a bit more brown. Or let's set it to blue. We can now add a second color ramp. And we're going to take the color of our small detail voronoi and plug it into the color ramp. Let's add a mix RGB node. And let's mix in this color ramp. And let's set it to color. And we are going to select a grayish blue and a green color. To make the details pop a bit more, we can play around with this soft light. And let's set it to 0.55 for now. This looks a bit off right now, but we're going to add some watercolor effects that is really going to set it off. Let's select the nodes after our color node and make some room. We are going to add a musgrave. And a mix RGB node. Plug in the musgrave. Oh, and instead of plugging it into the color, we are also going to plug it into the alpha, so we can get a custom color. Let's select a purple for now. And let's add a color ramp. And by controlling the color ramp, we can get a watercolor effect. So let's move the black to right about here. Select the white. And we're going to set it to a slightly grayish color. And then we are going to add a third color, which is a darker gray. And this is going to create this ring effect by setting our color ramp like this. This looks like it's a smooth paint dot of watercolor that has dried out. And we can make it a bit more jagged by playing around with the detail and the dimension of the musgrave. And this gives it a more convincing watercolor effect. Let's add a second musgrave. So let's copy paste the musgrave and the color ramp. Let's plug in a mix RGB node. Plug it into the alpha. Let's select green. This time we're going to set the scale to 3, or maybe even 2. And we're going to play around with our color ramp until we get a much larger spot. Let's choose a more khaki green. And let's add another musgrave. And also plug it into a mix RGB node. And let's set the scale to 4. And this time we are going to choose a light blue. Let's play around with our shadow. I'm going to set it to a slightly darker color. And by controlling the mix, we can get a bit of a softer edge. Let's also adjust the color ramp. I think this is a bit too green, so I'm maybe going to change the colors a bit just to see if I can get a different effect. And let's also add a color to our highlight. And we're going to set it to a more bluish color. The last thing we are going to do is randomize our musgraves. To do this, we are going to add a mapping node and a texture coordinate node. Plug all of the musgraves in. And let's plug our location from the object info into our mapping location. And this completely randomizes our rock. And this is the basic effect that we want to achieve with our rock. We can also angle our shadow by using the rotation tools. And by using the mix, we can also get a lot more texture into our shadow. One trick you can do is actually use our highlight more as a moss effect by setting it to a green color. One last thing I also want to show you is that by playing around with the scales of the voronoi, you can get a vastly different effect. I think there is a sweet spot by setting the smaller voronoi to a scale of 7. And that concludes our shader. So let's have a look at some different examples that I made with exactly the same shader we just made. I just played around with the color, with the different scales, the different mixes, and you can get some very interesting results. I don't know if it gets exactly close to a Ghibli movie, but I do think it gets a very interesting result that can fit nicely in any Blender NPR project. I'm quickly going to show you how to make this rock shape and how to add a line. So let's take our sphere, go to modifier, set it to displace, click on new for our texture, and click on show texture in texture tab. We're going to choose a voronoi, reduce the size, and we're going to set distance metric to distance squared. Go back to our modifier properties, set our coordinates to global, and set strength to minus 0.5. We don't have enough geometry, so also let's add a subdivision surface and move it to first. And instead of setting it to a minus value, let's set it to a positive value. You can always go back to your texture in the texture properties, and for instance you can make the size bigger and then reduce the strength to get different effects. You can get some round shapes, you can get some more jagged shapes by playing around with the strength. And because we set the coordinates to global, each time we move the rock, we get a new individually unique rock as well. Let's now add a line around our rock. To do this, we go to our modifiers and select solidify. In our solidify properties, go to normals and set flip. Materials, we're going to set to material offset 1. And then we are going to go to our material properties and we are going to add a new material. So here, add a material and set it to an emission. We're going to set it to black for a black line and use blackface culling. We also want to set the shadow mode to none. And then when we go back to our modifier properties, we can control the thickness to get a different effect. I'm going to set it to minus 0.01. And to get a softer line, we can also use a more grayish line. And that's it. I'm going to share the source files of these examples and of the shader below. I hope you liked it. Let me know what you think of this shader in the comment section. Please like and subscribe. And see you next time.